What happens if appraisal is lower than offer? The appraisal gap clause explained. That's our topic today. We'll get started right after this. Hi, I'm Kim Ward. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I am a certified probate real estate advisor. I am an expert at helping executors, administrators, and trustees with homes in probate or trust administration. In our current market, what happens if appraisal is lower than offer? This is the appraisal gap clause explained. In competitive housing markets like we're having right now, buyers need to have more together than just their finances. Even the ideal buyer client with the great finances, those clients that know what they want and are ready to act quickly on what they want, should be willing to make certain concessions regarding their dream home. Oftentimes in this type of market, that means writing an offer higher and sometimes substantially higher than the list price. And that's where an appraisal gap comes into play. So what is appraisal gap coverage? It is when, to get an offer even looked at, nevertheless accepted, the buyers have to be willing to go much higher than the list price. The list price is the asking price of the seller. Some buyers think, oh, I'll just offer what they're asking for the home. But when offering the asking price instead of above the asking price, the buyers will have a hard time becoming the new owner of the property. But one thing that can happen when the buyers offer a higher price than the asking price of the seller, there may be an issue with the appraisal. So the appraisal gap guarantee clause, it states that if a home or condo, a property, would appraise for lower than the offered price by the buyer, that buyer would bring the money, the difference between the offered price and the appraised price, they would bring that to the table. So the buyers would be making up the entire difference between the appraised value and what they had offered on the property. What happens if appraisal is lower than offer? Here's an example. Say a home is listed at $700,000. and it goes under contract after heated negotiations. It goes under contract at $750,000. However, the appraisal came in low, perhaps at $705,000. The buyer's mortgage lender will not cover that difference. They won't cover the appraisal gap for the buyer. In this scenario, the buyer is going to have to either fork out an additional $45,000 in cash to make the deal happen, or convince the seller to accept the $705,000 appraisal price, or everybody walks away from the deal. Of course, a seller like you are not going to like the option of taking $705,000 when the buyer had agreed to $750,000 with an appraisal gap. So that's why we like to see the appraisal gap guaranteed by the buyer in writing when that offer is above the list price. Sellers want to have some type of assurance that the buyers are going to bring in that difference because that's what they agreed to. And they also want to make sure that the buyer has the money to bring in that difference. I just finished helping with a home in Chula Vista. The list price was a range $599,000 to $629,000. We had 16 offers, and after negotiating, I helped to negotiate a VA buyer, but the purchase price that they agreed to was $675,000. I made sure that in the counteroffer that I sent back to the buyer that there was an appraisal gap. We ended up putting a $25,000 appraisal gap. This again is called appraisal gap coverage. It's the insurance that the seller is going to get what the agreed upon price is, with the buyers paying the difference between that home's appraisal and the price that they offered to the seller. To modify the previous example, let's say the house was listed at $700,000. The buyer offers $710,000 for the property with that appraisal gap, and the appraisal comes in at $705,000. That's when the appraisal gap now kicks in. The buyer comes to the table with $5,000 additional cash to cover that appraisal gap. They take that $5,000, goes to the escrow company here in San Diego County and is held in the escrow, and the escrow company puts that $5,000 towards the purchase price. So if a seller is looking at two almost equal offers, and one offer should happen to have an appraisal gap, but the other doesn't, my recommendation is we go with the appraisal gap, because the seller has a better chance of actually getting what the agreed upon purchase price is between the seller and the buyer. Of course, I would verify that that buyer had additional funds to cover whatever appraisal gap they are offering. We want to make sure that that buyer has enough funds for their down payment, their closing costs, and the appraisal gap. Once the appraisal report comes back, the buyer will need to review it with their agent. So what happens after appraisal comes in low? If the home appraisal comes back in lower than the agreed upon purchase price between the seller and the buyer, there are a few options that can keep the transaction alive. Of course, the first one is the buyer makes up the difference. They bring that cash into escrow. The buyer can increase their down payment to make up that difference. For example, if the buyer needs the appraisal to come in at $750,000, but it comes in at $740,000, the buyer can pay that $10,000 difference to escrow to put towards the purchase price. What the lender is concerned about is the ratio between the loan and the appraised value of the property. They're not necessarily concerned about the purchase price. So that's a bit about appraisal gaps. I hope you found it of value. As always, go ahead and comment below any stories, any questions you have. Like this video, hit the bell button and subscribe so that you can be informed that I have another weekly video available for you to watch. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.